Afternoon, and welcome to the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding 2022 Annual Conference, entitled, and importantly entitled, Business Unusual, A Rapidly Changing World Calls for Adapting Peacebuilding in Africa. My name is Nancy Walker, and I'm currently a Public Policy Fellow with the Wilson Center's Africa Program, and on behalf of the Wilson Center and the Carnegie Corporation of New York, thank you very much for joining us in person and online for the opening public session of this conference. Through its Africa program, the Wilson Center works to address the most critical issues facing Africa and U.S.-Africa relations, to build mutually beneficial U.S.-African relations, to enhance knowledge and understanding about Africa in the United States, particularly among policymakers. Over the next 5 days, this conference will address key issues related specifically to peace building in Africa, and we hope you will continue to join us at the public events throughout the week, both in person and online. This conference is particularly well-timed as the Biden-Harris administration has just released a strategy for sub-Saharan Africa, and it is also well-timed because President Biden will host the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in mid-December, and there are colleagues across the United States government who are working now to prepare the summit and its program. We're hoping very much that the discussions that come out of this coming week will help inform that preparation. It is now my very great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Mark Green, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, to give a few opening remarks. Ambassador Green has a long and distinguished career in public service, including as Executive Director of McCain Institute, Administrator of our next-door neighbor, the U.S. Agency for International Development, President of the International Republican Institute, President and CEO of the Institute for Global Development, and Senior Director of the Global Leadership Coalition, and United States Ambassador to Tanzania. His ties to Africa go deep, and in 2014, President Kikwete of Tanzania presented Ambassador Green with a special presidential certificate of recognition and appreciation. Before that, he served 4 terms in the United States House of Representatives representing Wisconsin's 8th District. Ambassador Green has a passion for and commitment to Africa. His leadership in U.S.-African relations is well known, extensive, and deeply appreciated. It is my very great pleasure to turn the mic over to him right now.
Thank you, Nancy, and thanks for leading this session for us. I appreciate it very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I join Nancy in thanking all of you for joining us in person or virtually. On behalf of the Wilson Center, please allow me to welcome you to the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Annual Conference 2022. As Nancy said, this year's title is Business Unusual. A rapidly changing world calls for adapting peacebuilding in Africa. I think we all agree that that title is particularly appropriate. Appropriate because peace is at stake in so many parts of the continent. But also, I think it's appropriate because we recognize there is so much that can be done in Africa. As Nancy mentioned, I am an unabashed Africa enthusiast. I believe that we are entering Africa's time on the world stage. And I think the great challenge for Americans and for countries outside of Africa is to do what we can to get tools and resources in the hands of that young continent and young African leaders, and then sit back and see marvelous things happen. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Wilson Center, we are unlike other think tanks and centers. Congress established us some 5 decades ago for the purpose, in their words, of strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. So what does that actually mean? It means that while many centers deal in data and information, Congress created us to go further into scholarship and learning. Our currency is knowledge, our focus is independent analysis, and our purpose is developing options and recommendations that decision makers and thought influencers can believe in. And we are fiercely nonpartisan. In support of this mission, our Africa program serves as a first port of call for addressing the critical issues facing Africa and U.S.-Africa relations. Through our work with the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, our Africa program is able to focus on addressing conflict prevention, peacebuilding, and security. SVNP is a network of 22 African policy and research organizations that work to bring African analyses and perspectives to key issues in U.S.-Africa relations. Funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the project provides avenues for African researchers to engage with, inform, and exchange perspectives with U.S. and international policy makers. The goal of this work is, simply put, to develop and nurture the most appropriate, cohesive, and inclusive policy frameworks on issues touching peace building and state building in Africa. Over the last 10 years, the network has hosted 36 scholars from across the continent and published over 60 publications. In 2021, SVNP published the open access book, The State of Peacebuilding in Africa, Lessons Learned for Policymakers and Practitioners. This remarkable book features contributions from several members and has garnered over 168,000 downloads since its publication. In July of this year, 2 SVNP members testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee's Subcommittee on Africa and before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Most recently, during the swearing-in ceremony of our former African Program Director, Dr. Monde Muyangwa, who is now USAID's Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Africa, Administrator Samantha Power specifically cited the work of this wonderful network and project. These are just 2 examples of the many times the network has interacted with U.S. policymakers. The network is also active across the African continent, with African governments, regional economic bodies, the African Union, civil society, and more. And finally, the importance of the network is reflected in who is gathered here for this week-long conference. We are truly grateful for the many representatives here from the SVNP member organizations across the continent, and it is truly our honor to host you. I would also like to personally thank Dr. Stephen Del Rosso and the Carnegie Corporation for their steadfast support and their guidance over the last decade. We are confident with the support of Carnegie that the best days lie ahead for SVNP and the difference that it can make. As we gather and reconnect this year, it's too obvious that the global peace and security landscape is currently undergoing significant changes and challenges. We've seen consecutive shocks such as COVID-19, climate change, and the collateral impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We see that this has caused a wide range of challenges for African communities and African leaders. But in some cases, it has not so much caused the problems, but revealed them in the form of increasing fragility and pressure on governing institutions. Governments that were still at work in building citizen responsiveness and capacity struggled to cope with rising food insecurity and conflict. And as the saying goes, sometimes people vote more with their feet than with their hands, which means that we have seen more and more people deal with conflict and economic insecurity by fleeing their homes. Human displacement is at record levels, not just in Africa, but all around the world. The number of internally displaced persons has increased sharply, often due to increasing conflict. But there are also so many hopeful signs and positive developments. The acceleration of economic integration through the African Continental Free Trade Area and progress that we're all seeing on the digital transformation, those open new opportunities for advancing development goals, for harnessing a young continent, young leadership, and young ideas. And I believe that we're seeing Africa just beginning to realize this promise. We're only just starting to see Africa take advantage of what these trends offer. This conference will assess the current state of peace building and security in Africa and analyze how peace building approaches can or should change to fit the current environment. Throughout the week, you'll hear from subject matter experts and practitioners, as well as senior U.S. officials and policymakers. We are lucky to be hosting Lisa Peterson, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the State Department's Bureau of Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor, and Mark Stamilio, Principal Director for African Affairs at the Department of Defense, later this week. We hope that this session will set the stage for the rest of this week. And so again, it is good to see all of you here, and it is good to see this discussion get underway. As I mentioned when I started, we do see challenges in many parts of the continent, but I think we're also seeing very, very hopeful and helpful signs. If we can just, as a group, share ideas, share approaches, share lessons learned, we can better tap into the great potential that we all see. With that, I'd like to turn the proceedings back over to Dr. Nancy Walker. Again, Nancy, thank you so much for leading us.
Pleasure. Thanks for being here. Okay. Ambassador Green, thank you very much. Your words to start us off are much appreciated. May I first invite, before we get going, our 4 panelists, speakers, to come up and seat yourself here at the table. Take your name tags off while you're doing it. And while our distinguished speakers are getting settled, I would like to remind everyone, for those of you joining us online, you may follow along on our Twitter account at Africa Up Close using the hashtag Peacebuilding in Africa. To ask a question, you may tweet us or use the chat box function on the event webpage. Let us think about the topic for our discussion today. Ambassador Green touched upon some of the many challenges and rapid changes that are occurring globally and how they are integrally linked to peace and peace building in Africa. I would like to now welcome 4 members of the SVNP network to discuss what they see as the greatest challenges and what they see as the most important actions for doing peace building differently, business unusual, and more effectively. Let me introduce them. We have Dr. Keze Nwoha, is the director of the Women's International Peace Center in Uganda. Mr. Anas El Gomati is the founder and director of the Sadek Institute in Libya. Ms. Faith Mabira is a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. And Father Nzadi is the director of the Centre des Études pour l'Action Sociale, CIPAS, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm going to ask each of you one question and ask you to answer in 3 minutes. And everyone knows we keep to time here. And I'll start with you, Dr. Helen, and then we'll go down the line. Question for you, please. What are some of the key developments globally and in Africa that have impacted peace and security, and what do they mean for peace building? The floor is yours.
Can I speak from here?
Yes, you may.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Nancy. And after listening to Your Excellency, the Ambassador, of course, we know very well that COVID is one of the factors that has impacted globally on peace and security, but also has its own gendered impact. And some of the researches that we conducted in terms of the impact of COVID on women, peace, and security shows evidence of exacerbated existing gender inequalities, conflict, and insecurity. The effects of COVID are global, but dependent on context and intersecting identities of women and girls, men, and boys, such as refugees and IDPs. And I'm glad he also mentioned that. We noted that COVID-19 also impacted on many of the peace operations, sometimes delayed the implementation, as we saw in South Sudan. But also we saw a lot of resources which were supposed to meant for peace building being diverted to responses to COVID. And of course, we had added stress to governance systems that were already under pressure from existing conflicts and violent extremisms. Of course, increased migration, which has gender dimensions. The other is climate-related peace and security risk. We noted increasing temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, drought, and flood have disrupted livelihoods and forced migrations in some African countries. Climate change contributes to farmer-herder competition over land and water, and we've seen this a lot within the West African region. But also, elites have taken advantage of climate-related disruptions by exploiting marginalized groups, particularly young people, by recruiting them into extremisms. What we've seen, particularly in the Great Lakes region, is that there have been several attempts to build peace, particularly between DRC, Rwanda, Uganda, and most of the rebel groups. And although peace deeds were signed, conflict continues and promises remain unfulfilled in that region. Little has been done to move away from day-to-day conflict management and towards proactively building the capacity of societies to develop their own culture of conflict prevention, to resolve disputes and address the root causes of conflict, particularly tensions over control of resources, as we know in the DRC. Yet this has not been the focus of peace deals in the region. Rather, international engagement continues to be fragmented, as you might all know, with emphasis on symptoms and no comprehensive framework to end the conflict. And of course, we all know that a number of countries are benefiting from that. Most peace-building initiatives have failed to take into account the complexities of the conflict and its implication at national, regional, and international level. Most initiatives have focused on the willpower of the state and not on local communities. And as long as we continue to marginalize local communities, I don't think we are going to be able to build sustainable peace in most of these African countries. What would I suggest? I think we need to focus on an approach to peace building that calls for a three-legged adaptive solution involving international community, the local political actors, but also local communities who are affected by the conflict. Peace interventions and strategies such as local, international, and regional instruments must be interpreted and localized to filter out what it means in the different communities. So context is very important. In addition, all the conditions provided for international instruments should be informed by local realities. But I think peace building should be a condition for development aid and cooperation in Africa. Thank you, Dr. Nancy.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn the floor to Anas El-Gomati. And the question for you is, how have existing or current peace-building strategies and approaches been overtaken by new developments globally and in Africa? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to thank yourself and the Africa Center team and the Wilson Center for hosting us today and being back in person after a couple of years. So just again, a resounding congratulations for that. And to congratulate you on the title as well. I think business unusual is perhaps the best way to describe the business of conflict, because conflict isn't new, but the way that we're fighting wars now has been overtaken. It's changing. And I think that's what I want to center my ideas on. The ways that we fight war, conflict has changed, but how we end conflict has kind of remained the same. And I think that's a big, big challenge. So what I mean by this, for example, in the case of Libya, is that instead of where we would traditionally see militaries being deployed, we now see the increasing use of mercenaries, where we used to see conventional media being used to drive up sentiment, to ripen people towards conflict. We now see that it's media influencers that are moving into that space, not just on Twitter and on Instagram or Snapchat, But the fact that they don't hold an emblem, they're not representing a state in the same way that a military would represent a state, but a mercenary doesn't. And drones are now being used in fascinating ways that don't carry an emblem of a state. They carry the emblem of the technology producer, a company. And I think this is an unusual kind of set of circumstances. I would even add to that financing has changed, and I'll come back to that, in the way that we finance conflict. I mean, that's probably the most bizarre way that it's been done. In Libya's case, our currency, our sovereign currency, was printed by another country illegally and used to fund the war. So it's an unusual set of circumstances, and then it begs the question, how can we go back to the same system, which is very institutionally focused? Now, the first obviously being that in Libya's case, we had two peace processes, one in 2015 called the Skhirat process that was hosted by Algeria and Morocco, a second one that was hosted in Berlin called the Berlin process in 2020. And in those 5 years, we've gone from militaries fighting or even militias fighting, but we're now moving into this era of mercenaries, foreign mercenaries fighting on Libya, on Libyans. In fact, Libyans described it as like being spectators in a football match, watching two teams that you don't know fighting a war on your behalf. So I think that's one of the most accelerated developments. The institutional focus, I think, is probably bizarre because this idea of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again after it's been broken, the idea that you can just fix a state by getting a handshake between two men, traditionally, and conventionally it always has been two men, which is another issue. But the idea that two individuals, if they shake hands, or they sign a piece of paper, or they high-five, are going to resolve a conflict, I think that time is over. The idea that you can bring them into an institutional setup is also over. And the reasons are fairly obvious. I mean, we're living in a fractured mosaic of a conflict. The means of fighting, the means of funding, and the means of finishing wars have completely changed. And the institutional setup, what I mean by that is that we've used it here in our conferences before, we've used the term non-state actor as if it's unusual. Non-state is usual. The state doesn't always deliver security, doesn't always deliver and provide any facet of security. It traditionally has been done, and conventionally, a place like Libya has been done by non-state actors. But the idea that they're somehow unusual makes them peripheral to the solution. And I think and also to the description of why we're in this kind of conflicts. So I think to bring it back to what can be done, I think to kind of scoot over, it's quite a difficult question to consolidate in a few minutes. But I think the first is just to take stock of those developments and understand them and ask yourself whether or not the prescription to what you're trying to fix matches the description. You're not going to integrate mercenaries into a conflict. So what is the end goal of a peace process? How do you withdraw these mercenaries? We have mercenaries in Libya on behalf of the United Arab Emirates, Russia, Turkey. Some of them have been openly said that their mercenaries are there, like Turkey. Others haven't. Russia continues to deny. The UAE continues to deny that they're there. We've had them operating with special forces like France, for example, that also claims that it wasn't there. So we're living in this era of plausible and implausible deniability during conflict. And intriguingly, we have members of the UN Security Council that are participating in that. So that brings you back to another question. The international system today, most people would say after Ukraine looks broken. I would have said in Libya it was broken. And it doesn't look like it's going to be fixed anytime soon. So the two things that I would say is, number one, matching your description to your prescription in terms of what's happening on the ground, who the actors are. If they're unusual or usual, you have to kind of get the prescription right for that. The second is to look at the international system, and I think the international system, at least in my eyes, is broken. The UN Security Council does not function to resolve conflict in the way that it used to. And then asking a basic question about peace. What do we mean by that? Do we mean a handshake, or do we mean enduring peace and stability? And are we ever going to see that era again? I mean, it's good to ask questions. It's not always good to just give a final statement. But my question for everyone else really is, are we ever going to see that era of enduring peace again? Or are we now in a new era? Because I'll reintroduce Russia to this. And I'll leave you with this parting statement that I think the way that we fix conflicts is like the game of checkers. But the actors are playing chess. And I think if you're not playing the same game or understand the rules of that game, then you're going to be severely limited. Some actors don't look to win or lose. They look to disrupt. That's a very different way of fighting wars. It's a very gives you a long-term image and a long-term horizon image that's going to change. I often feel like when I'm the only North African on the panel, I often feel like we're a little bit further away, but we're a connected continent. The challenges that we're facing, I think others on the continent are facing. And I shudder to hope that, I shudder to think that they will migrate further south. But that's the question for me. If there are more actors playing chess and we're still playing checkers, then we need to get a version 2 update. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Food for thought. Lots of food for thought both of you have given us. And now we will continue our discussion with Father Alain. The question for you is, why has peace building been so difficult? And what do these developments mean for peace and peace building on the continent? Why so difficult?
Thank you very much. I will focus my intervention on the case of DRC and the Great Lakes region, which has been under various conflict insecurity for the past 20 years or so. So peace-building approaches, mainly based on military approach, have been very challenging, producing only very insignificant results so far. And last May, CEPAS, the center I work for, organized a 3-day workshop on conflict and insecurity in the eastern part of the DRC. So participants, including scholars, civil society activists, political leaders, etc., focused on 3 regions of the DRC where conflicts are ongoing for the last decades: Ituri, North, and South Kivu. So during the 3 days, participants did 3 main things. 1, discussed the reasons underlying the continuation of the conflicts in the DRC, exploring the logic of local conflicts and the means of solution. 2, identify the relationship between local conflicts and national actors, the impact of the intervention of neighboring countries in the east of the DRC in the continuation of conflicts. And finally, 3, propose actions to be taken at the national level to make the conflict in the eastern parts of DRC a priority for national governance, in the hope that this dreadful part of our contemporary history will become nothing more than a sad memory. So we came up with some solutions. 1, diversify approaches to conflicts to avoid the trap of exclusively favoring the military approach, which seems to show its limits. Indeed, it would be necessary to identify the problems that cannot be solved by the military approach alone, in particular the question of the peaceful coexistence of local communities and access to natural resources and means of survival. 2, restore state authority. 3, break the business of war, whose actors are recruited not only among militias, national and international, but also among generals and other military officers. 4, rethink land governance, increased number of land disputes in that part, given that this is an extremely lucrative sector. 5, better manage population movements from one area to another, often in search of survival. These large population movements can become, in the long run, a source of inter-ethnic conflict if they are not well supervised. 6, rethink the policy of relocation and compensation of local communities for reasons of mining or oil exploitation, especially in that part of the country. 7, strengthen the fight against impunity. 8, practice active diplomacy with neighboring countries. 9, strengthen good governance to allow more equitable access to the country's wealth. 10, put in place an overall strategy to deal with security challenges, better link the different services, the army, the police, and intelligence services. 11, set up a focal point that would deal specifically with the conflict zones in the east part of the country. 12, enter into negotiations with different groups, avoiding collective integration into the national army, because that's what happened in the past. And then it's very difficult to control them once they are already integrated in the national army. And finally, avoid what I call the over-politicization of issues in that part of the country. So those were the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our final speaker today is Faith, and the question for you, please, are what are some 2 to 3 of the key opportunities or the ways that peace builders in Africa have already adapted their approaches and strategies? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nancy. I think to answer that question, we need to also have an appreciation of just some of the observable trends and dynamics that have also provided opportunities for that adaptation to take place. So Anas already talked largely about the regionalization and the internationalization of conflict that we've seen, because once we understand that particular aspect of how conflict, for instance, has played out in the African context, it presents to us an interesting case in terms of dealing with not only the multiplicity of actors on the ground and how they prolong the conflict dynamics, but also identifying how we need to tweak our approach to sort of make it attuned to that kind of development, for instance. So some of the ways that we are seeing peace builders in Africa taking notes of this is, for instance, we're beginning to see an approach towards using largely your predictive models, but merging that with cartography. So you have peace builders using geospatial mapping, using quantitative predictive modeling in one sense, and actually leveraging your experts on the ground to sort of map out a model in which we can identify and predict where the next conflict would be. So by using the crowdsourcing and using your experts on the ground and even lay people to sort of map out and predict where the next episodes, for instance, of conflict will be. And this is also bearing on the importance of context, because historically literature has also showed us that an adequate predictor of where violence is going to erupt is where there's been previous violence. So in taking that into account, then we see these peace builders doing that. And I think another interesting tool that is also taking quite a bit of hold is the idea of also borrowing it from people who do displacement, who study the displacement patterns, are also using open source data and merging that also with algorithms, using over a number of indicator sets to also use the displacement models and also tie that to the structural drivers of conflict. Those are some of the tools that peace builders are using. And also, I think interestingly is the idea of also employing to a large degree, not neglecting the risk element or the risk analytical element of conflict. Sure, peace builders and early warning, for instance, researchers rely on their own sets of data. But when you look at the multidimensional aspects of crisis and the fact that a lot of the drivers of conflict are interlinked, we can't turn a blind eye towards risk analysis, understanding your structural drivers, but also your geopolitical risk factors. That's increasingly important because of how they merge also with macroeconomic indicators. So when we utilize those kinds of instruments, I think it begins to open up an interesting conversation about how we are adapting peace building tools going forward. So I think those are the three I would say that I've identified, and I'm open to hearing comments on whether there's more models and more approaches that are being tested on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Much food for thought from all four of our distinguished panelists today. Yes, and to be continued. The wheels are turning, as I'm sure everyone in the audience and joining us online. Lots to think about. But before I open the floor up to our guests in the audience, I have one more question for the four of you. And I'll start with Faith, and we'll go backwards. Business unusual. Business unusual. Calls for updated, adaptive, new approaches. What's your top recommendation for how we need to do peace building differently and more effectively? Business unusual. Faith, you first.
There's a lot I could go, but if I was to say my top, you only want one recommendation?
One right for now, and then we can build on that.
My one recommendation would be, for instance, I'd say we need to move beyond snapshot analysis. And by snapshot analysis, I mean we've become very beholden to a particular agenda that is inherently linked to, some would argue, yes, we're embracing the local turn or the pragmatic turn, but when you really delve deep into some of the approaches that we almost turn to implicitly, it has a very top-down, it's very difficult to shed off the top-down peace-building agenda. So we need to begin to question that externally imposed sort of lens. We also need to ask ourselves whether our current systems, our current frameworks are actually up to task. It's the question that also Anas raised initially, and whether our regional and continental and even international peace architectures are actively embracing. Are they stuck in the past? Or are they willing to actually embrace and realize that we are living in a completely different reality? And if you don't adapt, you will die. You will wither away and you will die. And I think that's the question du jour, because even when you look at the multilateral responses to peace, the UN Security Council, which is the apex institution when it comes to international peace and security agenda, is caught up in a time, its mechanism, its functioning, its paralysis is because it's stuck in the past. So these are some of the things we need to contend with. The question of change, however hard it is a pill to swallow. Yeah.
Thank you. Father Alain?
Yeah, my top two recommendations in terms of updating or adapting peace-building approaches are the following. The first one, for me, is to prioritize a multilateral approach for better peace-building solutions, including issues of ethnic cohabitation, better mining and land governance. I'm speaking of the case of DRC. And this will avoid placing too much emphasis on the military approach alone to conflicts in the Great Lake regions, for instance. And two, avoid what I called earlier the over-politicization of conflict, which in most of the cases for DRC can be ethnic conflicts. Most people, I think, long for peace, and nobody wants to live in an unstable environment.
Thank you. Anas?
Yeah, so I'll also go back to what Faith was saying, because I agree wholeheartedly with what she said. The only difference I would say is I don't think it's a tweak anymore. I think it's a shift. I think a major shift in how we think about resolving conflict. And to give it a label, I would say we move away from an institutional approach, and that we need to go to a more network-centric approach. And the reason for this, I think, is that the idea of an enduring peace, and we often hear the term resilience thrown around, and we talk about communities and trying to build resilient communities that are kind of immune from this kind of conflict. Well, signing a piece of paper is not going to end the conflict. No one is going to respect these multilateral initiatives. No one is respecting conventions anymore, because you can circumvent everything. So the day after a peace-building initiative completes, a malevolent actor, and I would argue that most of the actors are malevolent, are not ripened by fear of sanction. They're not ripened because they have so much plausible deniability. They shift and adapt. So I think a network-centric approach is iterative. You might take 2 steps forward and take 1 step back. And I think we have to think about this long-term process, not as having an end, but as just being enduring. That you're constantly monitoring things for changes. Having a network-centric approach also means that you don't have an institutional outcome. You don't have this idea that someone is going to, go from being an informal actor to wearing a uniform. I think that day is over. And so I would say network-centric approach over an institutional approach, and having a long-term enduring mindset that can be iterative, that can adapt with a changing world and with a changing environment that could collapse any moment. And the reason why I say this, and I'll end on this, is that look at the bandwidth. I mean, even Faith has mentioned this about these systems being outdated. The one thing we don't talk about is political will. Political will is not there. One moment you're at the top of the agenda, and then you've slipped back and put a elected politician, put it in front of them a certain name or a certain country, and they say, oh, you just finished that. I don't want to touch that for another 10 years. So we've got to change that and adapt and die, as Faith said. You know, you've got to change towards these kind of times. And I think a long-term iterative approach is probably the only guarantor against, flip-flopping political will. And also gives you kind of real skin in the game to go for the long run, because conflicts, in my view, they're here for the long run, where this idea of peace and stability, an enduring one, I think it's over.
Thank you. Dr. Helen, final comments yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll just be building on what my colleagues have talked about, to just say that we need a bottom-up approach that recognize community-driven needs to address conflict. Many times there's no conversation with communities who are impacted by conflict. What we see is a copy and paste peace agreements. And sometimes when you review them, you actually see the same kind of language. There is no universal best practice that will fit different contexts in Africa. Our conflicts are different, the context is different, the impact is different for different groups of people. And so we need to take into account these differences and the intersectionality within them. There's also an important aspect to recognize the important role that women, peace builders, contribute to peace building informally, and to recognize that effort and build on those efforts. Some of these indigenous methods of peace building has not been tried elsewhere, land documented in Africa. It's not possible for us to export European peace-building methods into the African context, but that's what we see most of the time, people bringing in what they think should work for Africa. That wouldn't work. I also think that, international regional frameworks are not fit for purpose now, the way it is for us in Africa. We have different emerging kinds of conflicts that require us to also review how we are responding to this. Something that, is very important is for us to also review the role of the international community in peace building in Africa. Yes, we do recognize that they come in to help. I mean, we talk about the Security Council and some of its members and their roles and interests in the conflicts in Africa. And how do we begin to interrogate, review and evaluate what their interest is in terms of disrupting the peace processes? What benefits does it have for them? And how do we promote our own African interest in our own peace building, and how we want peace to be built? Should be determined by us in Africa and not by external actors. It will really be very important for us to see international community respect what Africans want to see from peace-building processes, and do follow that and respect it as a means of us solving our own problems. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Hard to... Yes, I'll just leave it at thank you all and invite questions from our in-person and online audience. If you are in person, please raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone, correct, Anna? And then you will identify your name and your affiliation and ask, please, a short question. And then I also have some from our online guests. For raising a hand, please. And we have about 15 minutes, so let's take 3 questions, and then you all can decide whether to answer one or pick one of the 3. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you to the panel as well. I'm Otilia Anamaunganidze from the Institute for Security Studies. All of the panelists have spoken to distance, both physical and metaphorical. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about a lot of work that we've done where when you speak to communities in Pemba and Montepuez and Mosimba de Playa in Mozambique in terms of what is their capital. It's not Maputo. In Gao, in Kidal, in Mali, it's not Bamako. And likewise, even in the DRC, in Goma or Ituri, the idea that Kinshasa serves the interest of the communities in the east, increasingly there's that distance. Now, you've all spoken to changing the kinds of interventions, and Anas, you've been the most provocative in this, around the role of the state. So my question is really putting it a bit on its head to say, how can the state complement actual peace building, and not how can the communities do that, but the other way around?
Thank you. You want to pass the microphone? Hannah, you can. Front row for now, and then we'll do middle, and then we'll pick up another three. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Mziwandile Ndlovu from the African Institute for Development Policy. My question is directed at Helen. Could you share even examples what you mean by indigenous peace-building initiatives? And you also say that regional organizations are no longer fit for purpose. I'm assuming you are speaking in the context of peace-building matters. You said that the international community needs to respect what Africans would need to see happening with regards to the peace-building scene. So are you saying that regional organizations do not have a role in this scene when you say that they are no longer fit for purpose? Thank you.
Thank you. And then in the middle here, and then we'll pick you up in the gentleman in the next round.
In the middle?
Right here, right here. You, yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Yacinthe Loua. I'm from Côte d'Ivoire, Serap. My question concerns Helen. You were talking about the implication of the community in the peace building process. I agree with you. I would just like to say that in Côte d'Ivoire, what we were doing was to involve all the communities in what we were doing. But after that, and when the political crisis came again, then the community were divided. Do you think we are still called to continue using the community or not?
Okay, no, hang on, but that's three. We'll let our.
Yeah, but I wanted to follow up on a question.
If it's, I will exercise the right of the chair. You may follow up with a very short, no.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry I've not met ISS yet, but so I don't know her name. You know, I was going to ask a different question completely, and then after her. Okay, so my question is this. Instead of talking about, the role of states, why can't we address head-on the question of rethinking the whole idea of the state in Africa?
Thank you. Hannah, take the microphone back. No more questions. Ladies and gentlemen of the panel, who would like to begin? Okay, the gentleman in the middle.
I'll begin, and I actually completely agree with the way that both questions were asked, because I think the whole point of my intervention was that we should rethink the point of the state, how it deals, how it delivers services, the idea that the state is fulfilling security. So states are often presumed as being this kind of, either they're the neutral arbiter to the conflict or they're a prize to be won. That's really dangerous. So much grievances, communities that have been displaced, brutalized, and then you find these Machiavellian or Faustian pacts where someone offers an individual representing a local community or a national community a position in the state, and they kind of forget about their communities at the end. So the first thing is to remove this bargain, this chip, this carrot, that if I end up representing the communities, I end up winning a party of the state. If the state is the prize, then your negotiation in the beginning is flawed. Number two, so the state is a party to the conflict at times. And if it's there as a prize, then it's an even bigger motivator and driver of conflict. So I would say removing those incentive structures, I think, is probably the most important thing.
Faith, do you want to take next?
It ties into what Otilia and Chris were asking about. In one sense, it's a question about center-periphery dynamics and how it's revolving around the formation of the state. And it's because deep down, there's been a preoccupation with the Weberian model of statehood, right? Monopoly of violence, provision of welfare, and also ensuring control over particular territory. That's been, it's cut and paste. It's what's been the main point of contention. And here I'm going to use Libya because that's the case that I'm mostly familiar with. Libya also presents an interesting case because, and here Anas can correct me, it's interesting when you look also at how when we leverage how the one that's in shambles, but the political process that has been pushed in the Libyan case, for instance, takes a very interesting sort of approach, and it's one that the UNDP has also pursued. It's a case where they essentially use local government, your municipalities, as a way of creating a base for provision of essential services. So citizens need these essential services in terms of meeting their needs immediately. So leverage local government, leverage municipalities to produce that service. And in the provision of those services, then you leverage that service and you use it almost as a way of enhancing the legitimacy of the quote-unquote transitional government that's been ushered in by the peace process. So you're almost using it as a way of creating an element of stabilization, if you want to call it that. And I think that's one way of looking at it. It has its risks. Inherently, it's not taken hold because the situation that we find ourselves in, but it begins to pose a very interesting question about the role of decentralization in thinking about how we push forward the elements of the peace agreement on the table. So what you said about asking how we want to approach the role of the state. And I think also when we look at this, the question of the state, it's a whole PhD thesis on its own. But to cap it very, very simply for me, it's the question of, yes, we question that model, but we also ask ourselves the idea of when we look at conflict dynamics, to what extent so Libya also is interesting because inherently we want to assume that they're fighting for control of, the governments are fighting for control of the rebels are fighting for control of the state, but or militias are fighting for control of the state. But when there isn't a central state in existence that's being contended for with the fall of the Gaddafi regime, there wasn't a state to contend for. It becomes a question of how do you then account for that resurgence of cyclical violence? It's because the armed groups and the militias are so embedded within their communities and their networks. So understanding that localization dynamic is very important in also gauging forward how we move, how we restructure our engagement processes. Yeah.
Thank you. Alain?
Yes,
We'll let Helen
building on that, the role of state, I think in terms of achieving peace in a faster way, we cannot do without the state. I'm speaking of Africa, in the case of Africa. But if we want that peace to be a long-lasting peace, a sustainable peace, local communities have to be brought into the equation. But I personally do not trust political leaders, at least our political leaders in Africa, in terms of delivering or really wanting to change things in terms of political will. Most of them don't have the political will. They are only running after their political positions, and everything is good for them in as long as they can achieve their goal, their own goal. And that's why I think the civil society organizations are really very important in our countries. They should come in and oblige our political leaders to, in terms of delivering or building a sustainable peace.
Thank you. Dr. Helen, and speak fast, speak concisely because
we're here for 5 more days, so the conversation will continue. I like at least that I've pinched on a lot of things. So in terms of indigenous peace building methods, I think traditionally we do have ways of resolving conflict. not just within the families, but within the communities where we use elders, leaders, cultural leaders. The challenge is we've not really documented this so much, but there are a lot of literature, on what has been used in terms of peace building, and then the approaches that we can adopt in Africa. Talking about the institutions not being fit for purpose, I want to build on what we're talking about, the political will. So you have the African Union that has the African peace architecture, that actually I'm not sure how it is functioning. If you have read through the peace architecture itself, they have the early warning mechanism that is actually being implemented by civil society organizations. And so you begin to question, what is the role? You see the International Conference of the Great Lakes region, for the DRC, they've not been able to resolve any of those conflicts in Eastern Congo. So the question is, what is the essence of these institutions? Are they really fit for purpose for now? So I think we need to review majority of the frameworks for peace building that these regional institutions have, including the African Union, and see how we adapt it. So that's exactly what I'm saying. Then in terms of communities' role in peace building, yes, you're right. But I think you also need to understand where we are coming from in these communities and how colonization helped to differentiate us around tribal and ethnic lines, the introduction of religion, and how some of these conflicts have religious, ethnic dimensions, religious dimensions. We're just having a conversation this morning about Nigeria and the fact that, if we're not divided along ethnic lines, then religion comes into play, and how this has been used by elites, to continue to divide communities. So even when communities have a common vision of peace that they want, there's a way that the understanding of what the international approach is and what our political leaders are bringing continue to divide us. And so we need to continue to rethink that. In terms of the role of the state, if we need to rethink the role of the state, I think we need to rethink also the governance processes and the way that we bring states into power in Africa, and if elections are the right means to determine who rules us and the dynamics of elections and what we have been seeing, in recent times. So it's kind of like a PhD thesis, like you said, that we really need to think through it. Who is defining our democracy? Who is telling us what governance is? And who is defining the state? So we're still following up on what we have inherited of what the state should be and who determines the state. But the disconnection between the state and the citizens is also so broad that it's difficult for us to even hold the state accountable, even when some of us know what is right for us to do, and how constitutional changes, it's happening in Africa. So you find a state where somebody has ruled for more than 30 years, others are changing constitutions to remain in power. It's a device. There are so many complexities around states building in Africa and how it actually impacts on peace building and sustainable peace.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of the official time, but is it possible to ask our colleagues in AV to keep us online for a few more minutes? Okay. Then what I'd like to do is ask you all to reply to the questions we've gotten from online. And then since we're all here, I will turn to the next batch of in-person questioners. So from our audience online, one of the questions is, what's driving the funding of current conflicts on the continent? And another question is, can the World Bank, United Nations, private sector, USAID, other development partners do more? Who would like to start with, and if we keep short answers, not everybody has to take those, who would like to address these? Go for it.
I'll take a quick one. I think in terms of what is driving the funding of conflicts, it used to be resources. At least in many ways, it was just resources. I think today we're talking about a whole variety of geostrategic implications. Sometimes it's to hedge in competing rival powers. That's changed because it used to be just the great rivalry between the US and Russia, but we also see emerging medium powers that swing like superpowers. So the geostrategic, I would say, the geostrategic aspects, logistics, mining rights, naval passages, even potential mining rights in the East Mediterranean off North Africa. No one has mined it yet, but there is a potential for billions there. Billions that no one will see the light of day for maybe decades. they're still fighting over it. So it's no longer just resources. What's funding it is the idea behind conflict in the beginning, which is the geostrategic aspect, and just hurting your opponents.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to?
Maybe just build on that. Yeah, natural resources, at least for the case of the Great Lakes region, land issues. And I come back to what I called, again, the over-politicization of some of small ethnic conflicts, and then politicians take over. And I wanted to just mention for the Great Lakes region, the work which was published by Dr. Minan, who is sitting there. So the challenges of building peace in the DRC, especially that part of the country, and he comes up with so many solutions and
Thank
proposals.
you very much. Faith?
So let me just add
yes,
to.
please, no, Helen. Go ahead.
What is driving the funding? Arms trade. In as much as we know it, I think it's time we begin to name and shame, people who are producing weapons and benefiting from these conflicts, and then bringing back the funds for peace building in Africa. Until we begin to do that, then some people will continue to play, the game of hide and seek within our peace building processes. Can the international community support? Yes, but please respect the local context, respect what the communities define as peace building, while you're supporting the process, and not for your own personal interest. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll be very quick. The question about what the international actors can do is, for me, I want to paint I don't want to call it cynical, but more realistic. I just want to add a dose of realism in it, right? It's because the international stakeholders still want to cling on to the liberal peace-building agenda for all its faults. And in continuing to do that, what tends to happen is that they foster that the approaches are not working. And if we are all in agreement that we are currently living in a climate of enduring global disorder, which is both the symptom of the day, and it's also what's driving the current responses to conflict. In this context of enduring global disorder, what has tended to happen then is that the geopolitical calculations, the geostrategic calculations come to the forefront. And the consequence of that happening is that they tend then to fall back into either transactional politics or interest-driven calculations that just don't end up being very beneficial in the long run. So it's almost like we are just sort of hamster in a wheel, and we're just going through the same motions. But it's precisely because we need to ask ourselves very prescient normative questions that also have implications in practice. And I think when you talk about those institutions, that's my biggest gripe with them at the moment.
Thank you. We'll take another round of questions, but let me interject. What we are seeing here is exactly why we are here this week. We are seeing concrete analysis from folks on the ground who know what's going on. You are experts, and you do not hesitate to give the message that you think international partners need to hear and colleagues across the continent. So thank you for that. Now we are able to extend, and 1, 2, and then in the back. 1, 2, 3, 4. Short questions. Really, like no lectures, just question. No comments. You guys can hate me later, but we're asking questions now.
Thank you very much. I like the question that...
Sorry, introduce yourself and your institution first, and then ask your short question, please.
Okay. I'm Nicholas, also from the African Technology Policy Studies Network, ATPS, based in Nairobi, Kenya. I like the question that was posed to Father Nzadi about why peace building is very difficult. And my question and concern is, will you agree with me that why peace building is difficult is because there are people who benefit from conflict? And until we research to understand the immediate and remote causes of any particular conflict, we will not be able to fix it.
Thank you.
I could go on.
No, that was, no, thank you for that question. Thank you genuinely for the question. Here, in the second row.
Thank you. Chukwuemeka Eze is my name from the West African Network for Peacebuilding. I wanted to start by appreciating Helen for her faith in African solutions to African problems. Unfortunately, she's discussing that within the context of somebody else's resources. So I wish you luck on that. The second thing is to also adopt an analysis about not just resources again. We are in an era, don't get me wrong, of the new scramble and partition for African resources. That's very clear. But I think there's also the emergence of new friends and foes. So there are emerging powers that also want strategic locations within Africa, and that's also creating its own challenges. But specifically in terms of question, are we over-globalizing conflict prevention frameworks, including the UN Secretary General's mantra on conflict prevention? Are we over-globalizing that?
Thank you.
Just 1 second, please.
Okay.
I'm also wondering whether the UN Security Council is now morally challenged to continue to provide frameworks for global peace, because within the Security Council itself are moral questions unanswered.
Thank you. Right behind you. Why don't you just pass right behind you? There we go. Please.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I'm Eugenia Kaitesi. I'm the Executive Director of IPA Rwanda. I just have one observation. From all these discussions, I find that we are really talking about different issues. And apart from Helen, we're talking about resources, we are talking about many other issues, but we are forgetting about people. And the peace that we are looking for is for people. So with this, I want to ask Dr. Ale, Father Ale. He talked about politicization of conflicts and small issues. Can he be more elaborate on this? What are the small issues he's talking about the, on the conflicts? Because mainly if our people are dying, if people are really not having peace on the ground, then conflicts will continue. Thank you.
And then let's just pick up the last 2 rows back. Second row in, yes, because you had your hand raised before.
Okay, thank you very much. Mine is not a question, rather it is a contribution.
No, question, please.
I mean, it's a contribution to the discussion that we are having. One, to build peace. We are talking about peace challenges. Where I find the challenges is vertical and horizontal issues. By vertical I mean the actors, international, state actors, and horizontal, I mean the local, whichever local may mean, but the missing point, in my view, is clarifying which peace are we building.
Thank you.
That is the problem. Thank you.
To Hannah, and then 2 rows back. Yeah, this gentleman's had his hand up for a while.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the Foreign Service, U.S. Foreign Service. So I may be asking a question from a traditionalist background. I'd like to ask Ms. Mabera. She said that the UN Security Council is stuck in the past. And I wonder if you could elaborate that maybe with some examples of how it's stuck in the past and how we might be able to push it into the present and the future, hopefully.
Thank you very much. Let's allow our panelists to go on. It's now, we're almost 10 minutes past our official finish time. I'm going to ask our panelists to each take maximum 2 minutes. And then remember, most of us, I'm thrilled that we have our guests from online and others who are joining us. But remember, most of us are going to be together all week. So if you don't get called on right now, you will have ample opportunity, I promise. So over to you, panelists. Faith, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I know time. So with the question that Dr. Eze asked about whether we are over-globalizing the conflict responses, peace-building responses, my question would be, my response would be that it's a bit inevitable at this point. And why I say that is because we are living in a very pluralist global order. There's very complex interdependencies, and in addition to interdependencies, there's also shared vulnerabilities. So when you look at just the interlocked dimensions of not only the drivers, the causes, the problems that we are facing that are of a global nature, then the fact that they traverse borders puts the onus on us to develop collective solutions. So in a way, we find ourselves cycling right back to the question of having collective responses to problem. So in as much as regions might provide solutions at that level, ultimately there's still the question of how the local, the regional, those layers of governance and layers of responses are still interlinked just because of the kind of global order that we find ourselves in at this point. The question about the Security Council, I'll try to be quick, but just to give you an example of how we're sort of circling back around the same problem. Look at, for instance, what happened after the Libyan resolution 1973, allowing NATO, the NATO intervention to carry on. What was the repercussions of that on the UN Security Council dimensions? The Syria conflict emerged, and what we ended up having was paralysis. Paralysis because of the geopolitical war of words, the geopolitical trade-offs, the kind of debates that are happening, and also the fact that there isn't adequate representation. Especially the biggest gripe with the UN Security Council is a question of representation, of just as a reflection of the changing shifts of power in the global order. The fact that there's now rising powers who feel that they haven't, relative to, for instance, just the percentage of the population they represent in global terms, and the fact that power in all its dimensions has to be reconsidered. There's structural power that is largely missing to a lot of these actors. We can't necessarily limit construction of power only to the material sense. So the question of structural power becomes important, the question of setting the agenda, and also the very self-driven and realist nature of that organization as a reflection of the post-1945 order is still dictating the terms of the debate and where the resources follow in terms of setting the agenda. So Africa, for instance, finds itself being mainly on the table as an agenda discussion item, but lacks the structural power and the material power to follow through and enact responses that are adequate in terms of its own agency in that regard. So that's just a snapshot in response to the question about the Security Council.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And before, we are all scheduled for a group photo, so really quickly, because we're keeping the photographer downstairs waiting, and I know that our online guests are delighted to hear that as well. Father Alain, please.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Maybe quickly, Nicholas spoke of how to people who benefit from conflicts. Yeah, I spoke of breaking the what I call the business of war. I mean, all those people are benefiting from different actors, not only political actors, but also all those rebel groups and international actors, at least for the case of the Great Lakes region, the eastern part of DRC. And the thing with the over-politicizations of issue, maybe Dr. Minani can speak to that if the chair allows him, but I don't think so. But those are just sometimes conflicts, small conflicts in among people who different ethnic groups can be solved very easily, but you will find out that some political leaders are like what I call intellectual, they hold an intellectual responsibility. A small conflict, they will make it become a big one because they are behind the scene, try to pull, because they want to achieve something.
Thank you.
I think mainly people on the ground long for peace. Nobody wants to live in an unstable environment.
Thank you. Anas and then Helen.
I'm going to pick up on this very point here. People do long for peace. They also long for justice. And that's what often happens, this perception game, that for someone, for one person's peace is another person's injustice. And I think that's one of the major issues here as well. And I think we often forget what you mentioned in the question, that we forget we're talking about human life, after all. And so the purpose of this is the preservation of life. And so I think that's where I want to come to this question about the morally compromised, the term that you used, to discuss the UN Security Council. I think it's gone further than that. When I say it's gone further than that, the very individual states that were in the post-1945 world order we're supposed to be the mediators and guarantors of peace, are the biggest compromises of it. And the game is quite simple. The game is, on the micro level, for a small community or an individual or a mercenary group, or a group of individuals that want to wage war, if they know they can get to that state, and I know this firsthand in Libya, because we've mediated with armed groups, and they say, well, we know a member of the international community. And what they mean, they don't mean a neighboring country. They don't mean Sweden. They mean a member of the UN Security Council, which means I won't be sanctioned. What is the purpose of the UN Security Council if it doesn't have a stick? And if it is the very body that is perpetuating conflict, then it's not only morally compromised, it's rewarding those responsible for conflict with the power to determine its course and its end, and they won't end it unless they are being threatened. I'll give you a short one about Libya. Before Ukraine, and this idea that NATO's eastern flank was being compromised by Russia, and everyone was all this moral outrage. There was no moral outrage when Russia was entering Libya, and that members of the Security Council were ensuring. France, for example, was operating its special forces in Libya, whilst the Wagner Group was operating there. Today, it causes moral outrage for them to talk about Ukraine. So it's this game of duplicity. I talked about implausible deniability at the beginning. It's not plausible. It's not implausible deniability. It's a joke, So I think this is for me where the solution to this is quite simple. I think we need either we need stronger unilateral intervention, and not saying, well, we have to do through the UN, because that emblem is also being borrowed. States use the UN emblem, and so we're convening a meeting of the UN in this country, meaning that they're also renting the UN. They rent a UN veto, they rent the UN's legitimacy. We need something that is fit for purpose. We might have to crowd it out. I think the African Union personally might have a role to play in that. But I also think when you look at the micro level of mediation, you have to crowd out the space of the states. You have to crowd out the space. I say the EU, not because I think it's the only solution. I say it because it might be better than the UN Security Council. And that's saying something. So all I'll say is, in a very simple sense, is crowding out the space for non-conventional actors when you're looking at mediating local peace, and removing the position that the UN Security Council is all things to all men. That's now severely outdated. We might need to either have strong states or an unusual configuration of states.
Thank you. Right. Dr. Helen, wind this up for us.
So maybe we need to define what a state means in Africa by ourselves. And even though Dr. Eze is praising me for promoting African solutions to African problems, I think, yes, we have what it takes to solve our problems as Africans. And I think whoever is funding African problems has the moral justification because of the nature of the world and globalization and what you talked about, our collective vulnerabilities, that whatever happens within the African borders would also have an impact globally on everyone. So a lot has been said about the Security Council. So I will just go to which peace are we building? I think we should build the peace as defined by the people, by the communities. And I would like to share that for different communities in Africa, what peace means is different for each one, because we are different, we are not homogeneous, our thinking is different, our cultures are different, our religions are different. But before we start, can we first define it within that context, and then we build peace from the bottom up? I'll stop there. Thank you, Dr. Nancy.
Thank you very much. This is our first public session. Come back. You see how dynamic both not only our panelists, but the members of our audience, who will have ample opportunity in the course of the week. Ambassador Green, who very graciously opened our session, is waiting to join us for a group photo to honor this whole occasion. So if you are a member of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, take off your name tag and get downstairs. Hannah and the team will get you down. And first, before we do that, please join me in thanking our 4 very distinguished panelists for a provocative, wonderful opening session. Thank you all very much for coming.